Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Imagine a political leader, right? Someone who, not that long ago, was actually calling to, quote, bring down the European Union.
Yeah, someone seen widely as a pretty ardent Eurosceptic. Now, fast forward to today, that same leader, she's now advocating for a stronger, more geopolitically agile EU. So what on earth is going on here? Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get you really informed fast. Today, we're diving into the, well, remarkable and frankly pretty unexpected evolution of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's stance on the European Union. Specifically, we're looking at her concept of a less but better Europe. So our mission for you in this deep dive is to explore how her vision aims to move beyond those old debates. You know, the more Europe versus less Europe thing. We'll uncover which policy areas she actually wants to eat a step back from, and maybe more importantly, where she wants it to take on more responsibility. We're talking particularly about big areas like defense and immigration. And we'll also look at why this surprising shift might actually resonate with a much wider audience across the continent.
So let's set the scene first. For most of her political career, Meloni was, well, let's just say not exactly an EU fan. Her Brothers of Italy party openly talked about leaving the Eurozone. They even wanted to change Italy's constitution to put Italian law above European law. And this wasn't ancient history. As recently as 2019, Meloni herself was quoted saying she wanted to bring down the European Union.
Exactly. And that's precisely why her election win in 2022 caused, well, a fair bit of anxiety in Brussels, to put it mildly. You have to remember, Italy isn't just any member state. It's the EU's third largest economy.
Yeah.
So having someone with that kind of Eurosceptic background taking charge, it naturally led to some pretty serious worries. Worries about political chaos, maybe, or shaking up the whole European project. The key thing to get here is the concern wasn't just Italy's internal politics. It was about the stability and direction of the entire bloc.
Right. But then, after she actually took office, something quite unexpected happened. Instead of pushing an anti-EU agenda, Meloni has taken this remarkably pragmatic stance towards Brussels. At a recent meeting in Romani, she didn't just sort of nod along with the idea of a more geopolitically agile EU. She actually called for a common European army, and she warned quite explicitly that the EU is doomed to geopolitical irrelevance unless it can respond effectively to what she calls the dual threats of China and the US.
So what does this all mean for the future of the EU? And maybe more importantly, what does it mean for you? I think the key insight here is that Meloni isn't just putting a new label on old Euroscepticism. She seems to be reframing it as like a strategic necessity.
Yeah.
It's not about shrinking Europe just because. It seems to be about building a more focused, maybe more robust entity. This could really redefine what European integration even means. Less about those, federalist ideals and more about pragmatic power consolidation. A strategic pivot almost.
That's a really interesting way to put it, a strategic evolution, not just a U-turn. And the core of this new thinking is this phrase, less but better. How does that idea actually depart from those old debates we always hear, the Federalist Dream versus the nationalist retreat?
That's a great question, because it does feel like a genuinely different proposition. Meloni wants to move beyond what she apparently called the somewhat stale debate between more Europe and less Europe. No, her vision instead is for a Europe that does less and does it better. It's not just about cutting back the EU's reach. It's about a clearer division of powers. A more surgical approach, maybe? It means pulling the EU out of some policy areas so it can really focus its efforts and maybe counterintuitively do more effectively in others. It's about efficiency and impact, not just size. Now, you're probably broadly familiar with how the Lisbon Treaty sets out EU powers, right? Meloni's ideas seem to focus on shifting the emphasis within those categories, especially the shared and supporting competences. Just as a quick refresher for everyone, exclusive competences are where the EU basically has all the legislative power, think customs union, monetary policy for the Eurozone. Then you've got shared competences, where the EU and the member states legislate together. Things like the internal market, environment, energy policy. And finally, supporting competences.
Here, member states take the lead, but the EU can help out areas like tourism, education, culture.
Okay, got it. And it sounds like Meloni wants the EU to focus less on most of those shared and supporting areas. Specifically, she seems to think things like environment, education, culture should be left entirely up to nation states. Feels like streamlining, allowing national governments to take the lead where maybe they're better placed?
Exactly. And the argument she makes, which resonates with quite a few people, is that these are areas where a kind of centralized one-size-fits-all approach from Brussels, well, it also creates bureaucracy, and maybe doesn't deliver the tailored solutions needed for diverse national situations. Member states, the argument goes, are better equipped to handle the specific needs and cultural nuances of their own citizens in these areas. Of course, the counter-argument, which you'll hear, is about losing unified European action on big cross-border issues. Think climate change or building a common European cultural identity. It's a trade-off, it seems, one she appears willing to make for greater focus elsewhere.
Okay, so that covers the less part where she sees the EU stepping back, but this isn't just about shrinking Brussels, as you said. It's about redirecting that focus. So where does Meloni really want the EU to lean in and do better?
Right. The first big pillar of her better vision is security. Meloni argues the EU needs to take on significantly more responsibility for the continent's security. This is where her push for deeper European cooperation on defense comes in. And as you mentioned, that call for a common European army, it's basically a call for a truly unified front in what feels like a very unstable world right now.
Yeah, and that quote you mentioned earlier from Nicola Procaccini, one of Meloni's MEPs, was pretty stark. With the European army, we can spend less overall, do more, and do it better. That definitely highlights the economic angle, doesn't it? But, the flip side is always concerns about national sovereignty over armies or the huge practical challenge of integrating 27 different military forces. How does her vision realistically deal with those, well, deeply ingrained obstacles?
That's a crucial point, yeah. And it's where the pragmatic label perhaps comes in. While she hasn't laid out a detailed blueprint for how to integrate forces, her focus on efficiency and sharing the burden suggests she recognizes these hurdles. The rationale seems to be multi-layered. First, public opinion in Italy is surprisingly supportive. Data from March showed 65% of Italians actually favor a common European army. Only 15% were against. Second, and maybe more practically, it's an attractive option for cash-strapped countries, like Italy. Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio is around 138%. They struggle to meet NATO's 2% spending target, let alone 5%. So funding one larger European army could be seen as much more cost-effective than trying to fund 27 separate national ones. Think about it, for a country like Italy, already stretched financially, pooling resources for defense might seem like a smart investment, like buying a premium security subscription instead of running 27 separate, maybe redundant systems. It just makes economic sense to a lot of people in her position.
Right, so the idea isn't just more defense, but smarter, more efficient defense spending across the whole bloc, addressing a real budget crunch for countries like Italy. Okay, so alongside security, where else does Meloni want the EU to do more, to step up?
The other really key area where Meloni wants the EU to lean in more is immigration. Her argument is basically that because of freedom of movement within the EU, migration policy only really works effectively if it's handled at the EU level. As you know, the Schengen area means internal borders are open, so national border controls alone aren't really enough when someone is inside the EU zone.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even if Italy tightens its own borders, if someone enters the EU through another member state with maybe more relaxed rules, they can then travel freely to Italy or anywhere else. It really highlights how interconnected things are, demanding some kind of unified approach.
Precisely. And Meloni has actually been quite influential already in shaping the EU's newer migration policies. She's arguably been pulling the continent rightwards on this issue. Maybe the most significant example is how she apparently convinced the Commission about the idea of offshore asylum processing. That's a pretty big deal. Late last year, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen actually endorsed this concept in a letter to other EU leaders. She even pointed to Italy's controversial deal with Albania as a kind of model. Now, it's important to remember, while proponents see offshore processing as a way to manage migration flows and maybe deter irregular crossings, it also brings up complex legal and human rights issues. That's very much part of the ongoing debate in Europe. Meloni has also been quite visible, quite conspicuous, in helping von der Leyen negotiate those EU-wide migration deals with countries like Tunisia and Egypt. It shows a very hands-on approach from her.
Now, this whole idea of reforming the EU, it isn't totally new terminology, is it? The European Conservatives and Reformists group, the ECR in the European Parliament, which includes Meloni's party, they've been talking about something called Eurorealism for years.
That's true. But what's important to understand here, I think, is that most other self-described Eurorealists within the ECR, well, they generally just want the EU to do less. Full stop. They're often seen, perhaps unfairly or perhaps not, as basically rebranded Eurosceptics, less interested in the better part of Meloni's equation.
Ah, okay. That's a really crucial distinction then. So if many so-called Euro-realists are just, rebranded Eurosceptics, what makes Meloni's better component seem more compelling or maybe more sincere than what we've heard before?
It's a fair question. What seems to separate her is this explicit and pretty consistent push for the EU to genuinely step up in specific high-stakes areas: security, migration. and combining that with a willingness to actually reduce the EU's footprint elsewhere. That does mark her out from many others in the ECR group and arguably makes her proposal feel more, well, realistic or at least more fully formed. And this brings up an important question. Why might her approach be gaining more traction now? I think it's partly because there's a fairly widespread consensus growing across Europe, not everywhere, but growing, that the EU does need to develop its own strategic autonomy.
Right, you mentioned strategic autonomy earlier. Just for listeners who might not be deep in EU jargon, could you quickly explain what that means in this context and why it's become such a buzzword lately?
Sure, absolutely. Basically, strategic autonomy is Europe's ambition to be able to act independently on the world stage, whether that's in defense or economic policy or technology. Acting without being overly dependent on other global powers like the US or China, it's about having the capacity to protect its own interests and project its own values and influence globally, which feels pretty crucial given the current geopolitical climate, the shifting power balances we're seeing. Now, a simple do less approach from traditional Eurosceptics doesn't really address that need for capacity, does it? But Meloni's less but better framework, it at least offers a specific path towards potentially achieving that autonomy by focusing resources.
Okay. So, putting it all together, is this just another one of those pro-European pipe dreams that sounds good but will inevitably get bogged down in Brussels bureaucracy? Or could this less but better vision actually, happen? It sounds like it's trying to thread a very fine needle politically.
Well, it does feel like Meloni's concept has potentially wider appeal than earlier versions of Euroscepticism, precisely because it tries to be pragmatic. Take proponents of strategic autonomy, for example. While her vision isn't as grand as, say, French President Macron's ideas for a fully federal Europe, they might still recognize her point. The point that the EU is perhaps spread too thinly right now to act with real geopolitical agility. Meloni's plan offers one way to address that, by concentrating resources. And on the other hand, it could also appeal to those Europeans who see the need for EU reform to stay relevant globally, but are maybe wary of those Macronite ideas that sound a bit too much like a United States of Europe for their liking, and really does try to carve out a middle ground, seeking effectiveness perhaps over pure ideology. Now, the political obstacles are still huge, obviously. Getting 27 member states with diverse interests to agree on such fundamental shifts, that's always the challenge. But the underlying logic of her proposal, it seems to resonate with a significant cross-section of European political thought right now.
So we've really unpacked quite a journey today, seeing how a leader, once known for strong Eurosceptic views, is now championing a more focused, maybe more agile European Union, concentrating on big things like security and immigration while strategically streamlining other areas. It is a fascinating and definitely unexpected evolution, almost like watching a phoenix rise, but maybe this time from the ashes of old Euroscepticism towards a vision for a stronger yet maybe more focused Europe.
And this really leaves an important question hanging there for you, the listener. Could this third way approach trying to move beyond that old, more or less Europe argument actually be the pragmatic path the EU needs, the path needed to navigate the really complex geopolitical landscape we're in here in the 21st century? And how might this kind of rebalancing of focus, less in some areas, better in others, reshape the EU's identity and its influence on the global stage? Could it lead to a European project that's perhaps more unified where it counts, yet maybe less intrusive overall? Something to think about.